Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for our Fantasy Authors panel through the Muse Writers Center. I'm Michael Candelwall. I'm the Executive Director of the Muse Writers Center, and very proud and happy to be the host today. This is our sixth event in our virtual Diversity 2020 Dynamic Voices for Change series. And over the course of the past 5 weeks, the Muse Writers Center has hosted readings, panels, workshops, and more that celebrate the voices of writers and artists of color in the Hampton Roads area and around the nation. All of these events have been free for everyone to watch and will be accessible on the Muse's website after the live stream has ended, and you can watch them whenever you'd like. You can go back and watch them again. If you'd like to be a sponsor for one of our fabulous events or the series as a whole, or donate to the Muse Writers Center, there's a link in the description box where you're watching this, or also on our website. And before I get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the Muse Writers Center here in Norfolk, Virginia. We have become one of the largest literary centers in the country, and we offer online and in-person creative writing classes in all genres for all levels of experience and ages. Our new fall class schedule will be released in early December, so check out the-muse.org, the-muse.org now and soon for all the online classes that will be available for our winter-spring session. And there's still a few remaining in our fall class schedule that are all online, and we'd love to have you join us for the next few weeks. We also want to make sure let you know that we offer tuition assistance to anyone who needs it. We never turn anyone away, and last year we gave out almost $30,000 in tuition help because we don't want money or anything else getting in the way of someone creatively expressing themselves. Also wanted to quickly mention that if you are or you know somebody who's a 10th or 11th grader, we have our Teen Writers Fellowship that's beginning this coming year, and the applications are online now on our website. The Teen Fellowship provides in-depth instruction plus mentoring with professional authors to juniors and sophomores in high school. And we actually then have you pitch to agents at the end of all that. And again, look at our website for more information. And we're going to be part of Giving Tuesday, like most nonprofits, so keep that in mind for December 1st. And also just to say, we offer hundreds of free literary events every year, like this one, but also including teacher readings, book launches, writers clubs, writer support groups, and much more. And tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time is our Diversity 2020 closing event, Music and Verse, which will be a fantastic evening closed out by Virginia's wonderful and newest poet laureate, Louisa Agloria, doing a reading. So let me now introduce our panelists this evening. And after my introduction, I'd like each author to briefly say hello. So Lauren Blackwood is a Jamaican-American New Yorker living in Virginia. Yay! Who writes romance-heavy fantasy for most ages. When she's not writing, she's a PTA and violinist who really doesn't know how to settle on one career field. Within These Wicked Walls is her debut novel. Lauren.
Hello. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Lauren.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Congratulations.
Why, thank you. Within These Wicked Walls comes out fall 2021. Not a solid date yet, but I will let you know.
And we'll have to have a book launch at the Muse and also virtually at the same time.
Yes, please.
That would be awesome. That would be awesome. Zoraida Córdova is the author of many fantasy novels, including the award-winning Brooklyn Brujas series, Incendiary, Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, A Crash of Fate, and The Way to Rio Luna. Her short fiction has appeared in the New York Times bestselling anthology Star Wars from a Certain Point of View, Star Wars Clone Wars Stories of Light and Dark, and Come On In. She is the co-editor of Vampires Never Get Old. She is the co-host of the writing podcast Deadline City with Donnell Clayton. Zoraida was born in Ecuador and was raised in Queens, New York. Let's welcome Zoraida. You have to unmute yourself.
There I go. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to talk fantasy with all of you.
Awesome. And finally, Leslie Penelope has been writing since she could hold a pen and loves getting lost in the worlds in her head. She's an award-winning author of fantasy and paranormal romance. Her novel Songs of Blood and Stone was chosen as one of Time Magazine's 100 best fantasy books of all time. And she started a web development studio in 2003 and designed the Muse website, among other websites, and is also an award-winning independent filmmaker. She co-founded a literary magazine and sometimes dreams in HTML. Her podcast, My Imaginary Friends, is a weekly journal of her publishing life, perfect for readers and writers alike. And she lives in Maryland with her husband and their furry dependents. Let's welcome Leslie.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here.
And Leslie, like Lauren, has been a Muse student in the past, and we're very proud of the successes that you all have had. I'm beaming with pride, really, and just joy. So let's begin. If you're in our live streaming audience, if you're watching this live right now, and if you have a question, you can type it in the comment section on the YouTube video or in our Facebook event page. It may be helpful if you write the word question before your question so our moderators can see your question clearly, and they'll pass it to us, and we will answer your question. I'd like each of our panelists to begin the discussion with this topic. How has the fantasy world, both inside the narrative of the book and also the world of being a fantasy author, changed in terms of diversity? I feel like we've come a long way, but there's also a long way to go. Anyone may start.
I'll start. I think that when I started publishing in 2015, the landscape was really different. And we were, there were far fewer people of color who were publishing, far fewer diverse voices of all, like neurotypical people, LGBTQ people publishing in terms of traditional publishing. I started out publishing, like self-publishing. And if you know my story, I was an indie published author. I published the first 2 books in my fantasy series as a self-published author. And then I was picked up by St. Martin's Press, by a traditional publisher. And I published indie at first because I didn't see I didn't think it was realistic for a traditional publisher to be interested in my books. Epic fantasy featuring Black and brown people falling in love, having adventures. It just wasn't very common, not as common as you see it now. So I think that the landscape has definitely changed as publishers realize that there is a market for these books. These books will sell, books with different characters will sell, and people really are hungry for different kinds of stories and not just the same fantasy, like traditional fantasy stories in the traditional settings that we've been seeing for 50 years. So that's how I see the things that the landscape has changed quite a bit.
Right. Zoraida.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that, with the idea that publishing has changed, but slowly. When I started publishing in 2000, my debut novel came out in 2012, but I started trying to get published in high school. And I went out with a novel with my agent when I was 18, and I got rejected, which was typical because, I was an 18-year-old with a book, and in my head, it was like perfect, but it needed work. But even though it needed work, the comments that we received were, we already have a Latino book for the season. And I feel like, one, nobody would say that anymore unless they wanted to get Twitter dragged, but they just used more coded language, right? And so instead of like being rejected for saying, oh, there's too many characters, too many point of views, or whatever, it was, we already have, we have our spot because we can only use one person from this background, even though there is no Latino experience, as we've learned with this election, right? There's no Latino vote. There's no one Latino experience. There are just many different kinds. And I'm from a very specific country. So there's that, right? To this day, I'm still, even within Latinx fantasy, I'm the only Ecuadorian author that is published in the YA sphere, right? Whereas you can rattle off multiple names from different countries in Latin America. I still get to be the one, which is uncomfortable for me because I can't encompass the history of my country in, which is vast, and centuries, old. But as far as specifically in publishing, I remember when We Need Diverse Books, the organization, first started in 2015, and it was because 2014, excuse me, and it was because there was a BEA Buzz panel, and every single person on that panel was white and was male, and so people took action. But that's not to say that these books have not existed. These people have not existed. Cindy Pon, Nora Jemisin, like Melinda Lowe. There were people writing in this space. They just weren't getting the attention that people are getting now. And that's the difference. I think the difference is there have always been writers in this space. There have always been people at the forefront, whether they have been relegated to self-publishing, or whether they just are with smaller presses and not given the marketing that they deserve. I think now we're seeing more of a change. Like, yeah, we're tired of like Lord of the Rings knockoffs. You know, I'm just gonna say that.
Lauren, you're an emerging writer, so what's your take on all this?
Oh yeah, I should have gone first because those answers were yes. But thinking about when I was growing up, middle school, high school, I didn't see a lot of books. I didn't read a lot of books that were kind of reflected me. I didn't get to see a lot of characters who looked like me. They were always sort of like generically brown. So like these days, now coming up in publishing, we get to tell our stories, like very specific stories. And then for a while, it was like sort of the Black struggle sort of thing. And now which is super important, not harping on that. We need those books as well. But I love that now we get to see a lot of books that are just people of color being people of color. They get to go on the same adventures anybody else gets to go on. It's not about, oh, you're Black. Why are you doing this? Why are you Black? Like, what sort of struggle are you going through during this adventure? It's just like, oh, I'm going on an adventure and I happen to be Black. So it's amazing that I get to publish a book in this time period where we still got a ways to go, but you know, we're getting towards a place where like people are people. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
That's all I gotta say.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, say Zoraida and Leslie, who, I mean, I didn't realize we need diverse books. It's been only 6 years, because I love that organization and it's such an important organization. In my mind, I thought, well, it must have been around for a long time and finally it got steam. But no, you guys just said it was a reaction to that panel in some ways. And wow, I mean, think about how far we've come in that 6 years, and you can really see an explosion, I think, of all voices, you know, of voices that have been unrepresented in a lot of ways. And I'm so proud to say that we've come a few steps forward. But what about what needs to be done going forward? I feel like it's still not an environment where I think those messages still do come through that Zoraida mentioned before, like, oh, we already have a Latin writer, or we already have this person on our roles of authors, when really it's not reflecting the culture as a whole.
I think that the hashtag publishing paid me showed a lot of inequities in terms of compensation. You know, authors in traditional publishing generally get advances. And there's all kinds of factors that go into how big your advance is. But, you know, there was L.L. McKinney, and I think it was Tashi Onibuchi. They started the Publishing Paid Me hashtag a few months ago, where authors were, because a lot of it is steeped in secrecy. Like, we don't talk about our advances, or it's not public knowledge how much anyone got. And so people were actually publicizing what they got for their books. And it became really clear that there's a discrepancy in terms of, you know, a multi-award winner like Jesmyn Ward, you know, who has won, was it the National Book Award? I'm bad with details like that. But, you know, critically acclaimed, and had to fight for a $100,000 advance, where someone you've never heard of, like a white author, male or female, people in his books you've never heard of, got hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so there's a discrepancy in terms of how much we're getting paid. There's a discrepancy in terms of the marketing and support from the publisher. And I think it also comes down to there's still not enough people the gatekeepers, the agents and editors, are still, they're not as diverse as they need to be. They don't reflect the authorship. They don't reflect the diversity in the country and the readership. So the people who are making decisions and about who gets published and how much they get, how much money they make, are still not reflective. And so there are those discrepancies that we're still fighting against.
It's interesting you bring that up because Danielle Clayton and I, we did an episode on that on The Bank for our season 2 of Deadline City, because in Deadline City we talk about the ins and out of the actual publishing as a business as opposed to just writing. We talk a lot about writing and like how we, too many deadlines, but we also talk about like how do publishers decide to pay us, right? And we just want to be as much as transparent as we can. And we look at people who write, who are our contemporaries. We're not saying like their books are better or worse than ours. We're just saying like we are contemporaries. We're doing the same amount of work, and yet a white woman with a fantasy, a European-based fantasy, is going to get paid 400 times more than me, right? So we just from the same publisher, right? And so it's about equity and how do we create something? How do we create a more equitable publishing industry if we only take chances on one person, right? We can say that yes, publishing has invested in some Black fantasy authors, right, and given multi-million-dollar deals to some people. But then again, how many of those deals are for books that reflect a pain narrative, right? How many of those books are about romance and just happy times, right? And so we don't have all the answers because again, we're not in those rooms. We're just lowly authors trying to get books published. But I'm just nosy, so I like to figure out as much as I possibly can about the actual industry, so that I can tell younger authors. I've had a lot of I try to mentor as many younger authors as I can and say, this is what you need to look out for. This is what you need to ask in your contract. If your agent isn't asking for it, they need to push. That's the only way that I know how to not just send the ladder back down, but how to create a more informed industry. I don't even know if this answers the question, but yeah.
No, I think it does. I mean, it's more of a discussion topic than a question. I was reminded, and I'm sorry, Lauren, did you want to pipe in? I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, that was all good. And I honestly forgot what the question was.
I was just talking about how do we get the industry to really to keep on progressing and be even better. Yes. Yeah. I was reminded, I have a lot of friends that are science fiction and fantasy authors, way back when I was lucky enough to sort of be like a in quotation marks, adopted kid of a science fiction fantasy illustrator named Kelly Freeze, a white guy, but he was like a second dad to me. And through him, I met a lot of interesting people. And one of the people I met is a Thai writer named Somtao Suchritkul. And Somtao, he has I think 1 or 2 Hugo Awards. He was a very excellent writer, and he'll actually probably be teaching a class at the Muse in the spring. He lives in Thailand right now. He was in America when I knew him, and he after many of his science fiction books, he described it as being kind of caught in a payment like a threshold, like that because his publishers would tell him that they would spend as much money on promotion as they did on the advance. So if they gave him a $15,000 advance or a $25,000 advance, which was pretty good for the 80s in the science fiction market, mm-hmm. they would only spend that much money. And then if someone else got a 6 or 7 figure advance, they would spend that much money. So they were almost dooming your books to earn a certain amount of money because they wouldn't put more into marketing. And so I think that's really interesting what you were saying, Zoraida, about the advanced levels that are very inequitable, and Leslie, because that inequity actually perpetuates itself, because it causes the sales to stay at a certain level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He actually had to change his name. He changed his name to SP Sumtow because it sounded a little bit more Anglo, and his sales went up. It's very
That's
interesting.
really interesting. That's interesting too. I, and the name thing is something else that we can discuss. I think that, I very briefly considered not having Latin sounding name, but then I'm just like, that's not who I am. I don't want
Right.
anybody calling me like Zara or something, like, because I would have wanted to keep, for my romance, I do have the pen name Zoe Castile. And I do think that I have sold more in the Zoe Castile romances than I did with my Zoraida Córdova romances. But that's neither, that's I don't have enough data I like having data to like back these
Right.
things up. But I have had authors ask me like, do you think I should change my name? I'm like, no, because there are literal people who, I've heard of authors who have like one ethnic grandparent, and they'll use their ethnic grandparent's name to like, not be questioned in their quote unquote own voices books. That kind of stuff is frustrating.
Sure.
Because it's not appropriate. And I'm just like, just use your regular name. Unless you have a very specific like identity issue that you don't want like your job finding out the secret erotica that you write, then then changing your name is fine. But other than that helps perpetuate problems in the publishing industry, I believe.
He also found that he stopped using Tor St. Martin's and made his first publication from a British publisher, and found his advances went way up and his sales went way up because I guess he was more accepted in England as a science fiction fantasy writer, horror writer at that point. And then they would then sell the rights back to American companies, and he would get much more advanced. It was kind of a strange, like back in the business section, like you were talking about, Zoraida, it was very interesting back how that worked in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I think we brought up Own Voices. I mean, Own Voices has been sort of a double-edged kind of a sword. Like the hashtag Own Voice is about telling your own story, and the fact that, a white writer could write a Black story and sell it faster than I could, potentially writing a Black story. But now we have a situation where everyone is trying to get on the Own Voices bandwagon, and it can be outing people in certain ways when they don't necessarily want to have their marginalization be public, but it's an Own Voices story. Or like sort of what Zoraida was saying, you have people sort of claiming things that are a little bit more tenuous in terms, just so they can get the Own Voices behind it. Like, sort of Elizabeth Warren claiming to be Native American type of thing where, are you? And strange things are popping up as Own Voices, very strange things. So,
Oh my God. Did you see, there was like, somebody used this hashtag for a pitch. It was like an equestrian book, and it was like hashtag Own Voices. And I was like, you're not a horse. Like,
oh my
God.
because you ride horses, like, that's
yeah,
not a marginalization.
I've heard of one that was non-binary Own Voices, but the character was a dragon. And it's like, oh, it's a non-binary dragon? I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's gotten so strange. And yeah, like everything is not Own Voices. So
It's kind of used as a gimmick a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry, Zoraida, I cut you off.
No, go. I already talked.
I mean, yeah, it is sort of used as a little bit of a gimmick, like, oh, hey, I know I'm going to get noticed if I use this. So it's like,
it's against the spirit of what it was designed,
exactly,
to do, which is to promote, people telling their stories that they have a lived experience in, and, having that, sort of be at least equal, if not preferential, to someone else telling a story that's not their lived experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have a question from our comments on YouTube and the website from Sylvia Liu. And I think this kind of, yeah, exactly. I think this kind of connects to what we're talking about. If your story draws from a specific culture, do you feel you have artistic license to make up aspects of your fantasy world or magic system, or do you worry about accurate representation? Maybe we'll start with Lauren, and since I see you on the screen. Right
now. I had to deal with exactly that because I'm not Ethiopian. So I did a lot of research. Oh, yeah, by the way, my book takes place in Ethiopia. So it's a Jane Eyre retelling. It's Ethiopian inspired. So I did do a lot of research. I think creative license comes in to play. I think you just have to do it carefully and respectfully. As long as you're doing it respectfully, like, I think it's fine. Like, there's certain things you can switch up. It always helps that if you're not sure, get some beta readers that are from the culture that you're writing in. Um, but yeah, I think as long as you do things very respectfully, and that not just you think it's respectful, but like the actual culture will not be offended by what you're changing for the story, I think it's fine. Yeah, I had to do a little bit of that. Spoilers, but yeah, I did.
Leslie or Zoraida?
So I think about this a lot because the very first time that I wrote something that would be considered own voices or whatever was when I wrote the Brooklyn Brujas series. And the Brooklyn Brujas series starts off with Labyrinth Lost. Labyrinth Lost is about a girl who she's a bruja, which is just a Spanish word for witch. And she tries to get rid of her powers, and she accidentally sends her family to another dimension instead. And so in the series, every sister has her own adventure, and there is no magical system for brujeria in any Latin culture. I think that there's no hard and fast rules, is what I mean, right? Because a lot of the witchcraft that comes from the Latin American diaspora can be traced back to indigenous roots or the African slave trade that was brought over to uh, uh, the Dominican Republic, Hispaniola, and Cartagena in Colombia, right? Those were the two main ports, in addition to Brazil. And so that's where we get this like rich idea of what brujeria, what witchcraft looks like. But there's still no rules in the way that the number of books that there were for, like, if you search Wicca, right, all of this stuff shows up. But if you search brujeria, like there's nothing like that. And if it is, I think that the things that are applied to it are the iconography is all European. And to me that didn't feel right. So I created my own system. Um, and I just thought about what it would look like if there were a magical brujeria system with gods. I created my own gods and pantheon, in addition to the spells and rituals that my witches celebrate. And I had to do that because there was nothing that preceded it. Um, and when nothing really comes before that, you sort of you're left to make things up. Not every culture has a textbook or a guidebook. And the one my debut trilogy was about a teenage boy who's white and he's a merman. um and so I wrote outside of my own experience with that, because I also decided, because I was tired of being rejected, so I was just like, let me just write from the perspective of like a white guy, and that's the book that got published. And so ever since then I've written my own, with a foot in the door. I just started writing about the other things that I was more passionate about. And then my latest book, which is Incendiary, it takes place in like a Spanish inspired kingdom. I did, even though like Spain is like the colonizer of my country, I still did the research that I needed to do to figure out what was life in medieval Spain like, or medieval Portugal and the Iberian Peninsula. And do you know how hard it is getting primary sources on the Inquisition from like non-Spanish Catholic writers, like non, so that it's like Jewish Jewish rabbis or people that were of the ones being expelled from Spain, it's really hard finding those kinds of primary sources, because even when you do your research, you have to think about who's writing these books. Yeah, it's just a lot very complicated.
Yeah, I think that for me, I didn't want to base my fantasy world on a specific culture. I thought that because I am Black American and, our culture was forcibly separated from us, we were prohibited from practicing our culture in large part, the slaves who came over. So I wanted it to be more of a mashup. And that's kind of how I approached it, because I view Black American culture as sort of a mashup. We were, whatever we could keep, we kept, and then we took parts of, the culture that had enslaved us, and we created our own culture. And Black American culture is very, it's about creation. It's about creating new things. So in terms of writing outside your experience and basing it on a real culture, I think that is fraught. I'm working on a manuscript now that is based in Black American folklore, and sort of like what Zoraida was talking about with Brujeria. I can't say, I'm sorry, Brujeria. It's Black American folklore and like the sort of magical system, like root doctors and conjure women and things like that. It's very regional. There's not one system. There's a lot of different cultures that came together and created something new, and it depended on where you were. And it took influences from the European culture and whatever African culture they had, and they were from different places. So there's more flexibility there, because there isn't one way to do it. Everybody's going to have, South Carolina is going to be different than Louisiana, than, any place else you do it. And so using that, it allows me to sort of create something new in that respect. And as much as possible, if that's a way that you can do it when you're writing from a culture that's not your own, if there are specific rules, I think it's going to be really difficult for you to change those, especially being outside of that culture in a respectful way. Like I feel like that would be kind of fraught. And I personally would stay away from that. But like Lauren said, you have your sensitivity readers, you try to get people's input from that culture, and knowing that even with that, someone could still say, hey, I'm offended, and I think you got that wrong. And you have to be open to that, and be open to that possibility that it's going to be very difficult to change someone else's culture and get it right.
Yeah, related. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, please.
I was just going to say, related to that, what Zoraida was saying about researching the culture, and there wasn't much there. There wasn't much sources I could go on for the Ethiopian culture with the amulets and everything. So the magic basically is based off the evil eye, which is a belief. There's not really any magic I could draw from. So I kind of had to create my own magic through those beliefs, and kind of adapted what they used in defense for the evil eye. So I kind of took what they had and then adapted it a little bit.
Yeah, and the evil eye shows up in so many different cultures,
Yeah.
right? And like in the Mediterranean, in Latin America, every time we have the evil eye, we have this ritual. I don't know if I think it extends to other parts of Latin America, but you take an egg, like a raw egg, and then in the shell, and then you drag it along the person's body, and then you crack it over in a glass of water, and that gets rid of the evil eye or something like that. It's like the strangest, home remedies, like home witchery. It's really interesting.
Zoraida, you were talking about the first series you published. You kind of had some issues and with people buying the books, and you're like, I'll just write from a white male point of view. It's interesting to me. My dad came here from India in 1960 and was part of the generation of people who came to the United States that kind of tried very hard to mainstream, and be in the main, be looked upon as just another American, and I always thought it was very weird when I was growing up when people would say things to me or put me in a certain position, which looking back was very discriminatory, but I just thought they were just weird people. I didn't quite understand. I'd be like, well, but I had relatives come over on the Mayflower. I'm just like, on my mom's side, it's very waspy, and on my dad's side, it's very Indian. And he also just passed away this year, and I got to meet through Zoom 75 people in my family I'd never met before, many of whom didn't speak English. And it's this, so for me, so that makes me think of the question, in the research that you all mentioned you were doing for different things you have been writing, have you learned anything about yourself that you didn't quite know? Because as Leslie said, like, the African culture was forbidden to be explored. And so is there anything that you've learned that really gave you some insight?
Yeah. I learned more a lot. I learned more a lot. I'm a writer. I learned a lot about the indigenous populations of Ecuador, because I used to think that there were, um, it was like this, it was just the Incas, right? And there were so many more, and there are actively like over a dozen indigenous languages that are still spoken. And and then there are some people who, some areas where their language was completely erased, so they use a different indigenous tribes language. And that stuff really impacted me in the last few years that I've been researching for a future novel. And that kind of stuff, and it bothers me. It's this helplessness of asking my family, like, well, what about XYZ person, like, where did they come from? And they're just like, we don't know. And so it feels like, even though I come from a country that, extends through the early 1800s, nobody still knows where, like, the origins. And that's very frustrating, and something that shows up in my writing a lot.
Leslie, I think you were going to say something too.
Yeah, I've been researching the thing I'm writing now. It takes place in 1925, and so I've been researching not just that time period, but like Reconstruction through the 20s. And it was, I've always said that I don't like research. Like, I did research for Earthsinger Chronicles, which is my fantasy series, which is a fantasy version of the 1920s. So I did research on like technology and when the things invented, so I could have it be reasonable. But it's still second world fantasy, so I didn't have to. I could fantasy make it. It's my fantasy fire extinguisher. It was, it's a little earlier than the normal fire extinguisher. But now that I'm trying to ground it, and I'm seeing so many parallels, not just parallels to now, but like the same exact things happening, from Reconstruction to 2020, in terms of, I mean, obviously voter disenfranchisement is one of those things, but just the way that Black people have constantly been fighting. Like, we know we've been fighting for a long time, but you think about, oh, well, after slavery, what were they doing? How were they fighting? They were fighting in the exact same ways that we're fighting. We've been doing this for such a long time and making these incremental steps. Like, just reading about the organizations that were coming out, the colleges that were formed, at post-Civil War, and people getting educated and then trying to really lift everyone up, and coming into horrible roadblocks, and, reading about lynchings and things like that. But I guess I'm just trying to say, like, the marches and the struggles and the articles. You read an article in a newspaper in 1920 that's complaining about cops not doing anything, or that the judicial system hasn't prosecuted anyone for all these lynchings. And you can read articles now about the judicial system not prosecuting, cops for killing Black people. It's the same article. It's the same pain. It's the same struggle. And so, like, I knew, but really reading them and reading people's words from 100 years ago that are the same words that they could be writing today is, it just impacted me a lot. It's at the same time, it's deeply painful, but it's also like, yeah, we've been working on this, and it wasn't just like they were just laying down and taking it and accepting it, which somehow feels like the consciousness is like, well, that was back then, and that was just the way it was. And it was like, yeah, it's the way it was, but they were still actively fighting against it with everything that they had, just like people are doing today. So yeah, it's just, that has definitely
History repeating itself, right? I mean, and us not learning from the past as a culture. It's right. Yeah, Zoraida.
It's interesting that you said that. First of all, I love the Earthsinger Chronicles. Book one, I was not prepared for how sexy that book was. The first book, I was just listening to the audiobook, and I was like, oh, this book is really sexy. In addition to, like, being all kinds of amazing. So thank you for writing that series. I think it's fantastic. And exactly like the thing that I'm searching for every time I look for fantasy books. But when you said that you see like how history repeats itself, I was looking at documents or a book of just documents of the Spanish Inquisition during that time period, and the event, like leading up to the Spanish Inquisition, there were orders and papers that there were every toll house would check a travel, and like if you were just traveling, they would check your papers to make sure that you were not of a certain religion or something like that. That you were from a specific region of Andalusia or Spain. It wasn't called Spain back then, but so if you didn't have these papers, you had to pay extra. You could buy somebody off and like pay them extra money to just look the other way. But like here you have like border patrols and people who are trying to sneak in to just get into another territory, and you see that still happening now at the border, only the Mexican border, not the Canadian border, because reasons. So that is also frustrating, seeing like 400 years later, more 600 years later, it's the same thing, like same thing still happening. Like it it's frustrating for sure. But when you said fantasy, that you had a fantasy fire hydrant or fantasy fire extinguisher, I have like in my fantasy that's based in Inquisition Spain, inspired by Inquisition Spain, I should say. I have like fantasy bathrooms where, because I just could not deal with like people not showering, so I just like invented pipes way sooner than they were supposed to be.
Yeah, that's one of those things we have to change things just so you don't have to worry about them walking to the outhouse every 10 minutes, I guess. I don't know.
Right, right. I just want to remind if you're watching this live right now, please feel free to type a question in on the comments part of the YouTube page or on our event page. We'd love to have you ask a question, and we have about 20 more minutes left. I wanted to ask a question, sort of switching gears slightly, but not a whole lot. Maybe we'll start with Lauren. What kind of advice would you give to an emerging writer, someone who has not published before, who wants to publish? What would you tell them about both the business and the business, let's say you are a person of color, how to navigate that, and also to have faith in your voice?
Well, definitely do research, not just in your writing, but about the industry itself, because there's a lot of things I did not know before I started this, and it's important to know your audience, to know your market, to know, like, for instance, a young adult novel, the lengths, the word count length is very different from an adult novel, very different from MG. So you have to know all of that, because it doesn't matter how good your book is. If you don't fit within the professional parameters, you're going to get rejected no matter what. I mean, there's small, exceptions, but generally you should learn the rules so that you can break them. I think that goes with any profession, but for sure this. And then, you have a story. Everybody has a story to tell, and don't be afraid to tell it. Like, don't be afraid that people won't understand what you're trying to say. Just because things aren't generally westernized doesn't mean that Western people can't relate to what you're saying. So I would say just go for it. Just, you have a story to tell.
Leslie, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, echoing that. In terms of trusting your voice, that can be really difficult. I think that can be that trusting yourself in general as a writer, because there's a lot of rejection involved, and it feels very personal. It can, because we pour ourselves into our writing. We spend a lot of times that first book, we spend years on it. And so learning to trust yourself and trust your vision and your taste is difficult. I think that having a community around you is the best advice I can give. When I mentor newer writers, I try to say, make sure that you have a community. I went to workshops, in-person workshops, and if they're, until we can get in-person workshops, online workshops, but find, that's one of the places where you can find a writing community of people to support you. And so that has gotten me through this whole time. I started a weekly mastermind with other writers so that we meet once a week and we talk about our writing businesses and anything from craft to business issues to marketing. And in having an organization, a group of writing friends, a critique group, something like that to buoy you, because we sit and we write these books alone. And so it's really important to have other people to bounce ideas off of, to ask opinions, people who are at different stages in their career who can give you advice, and then turn around and give back when you're at a different stage in your own career. So yeah, community is the most important thing that's helped me.
Agreed.
Zoraida, do you want to jump in?
Unmute myself. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Yeah, something that Leslie said, I think that when I first started in publishing, I didn't know a lot of writers. And so I just went and looked for my community. And the way that I did that was I would go to other book events. It's kind of hard to do that now, obviously, for COVID reasons, but it doesn't cost anything to support somebody, to like retweet somebody and show support that way. So when I used to go to book events, I'm an extrovert. So there's also that, like, not every writer is an extrovert. And I would just walk up to people and, like, you're my friend now, congratulations. You have no choice, I've kidnapped you. And so it's hard to really tell people how to do this, because it's going to be a different experience for everybody. I am fortunate that I'm in New York, so there were so many authors in New York at the exact same time. It's proximity, it's genre, it's sometimes backgrounds. There are groups where it's just like working parents who are also YA writers, like they form groups. I try as hard as possible to support up and coming writers, and just say, worry about your own paper, right? Like if you're an exam, like don't focus so much on what other people have, because everyone's journey is individual. And if you're only focused on what others have and you don't have, your writing is going to suffer, because your writing is supposed to be the most important thing, and it can't be if you're coveting, the advanced or the marketing plan or whatever that someone else has. So I think that would be my biggest advice to up and coming writers, in addition to just write your next book. I think we put so much pressure on the one book, when it's going to be multiple books that get us there. And so for some people it is that one book, but I don't think that's the case for everybody.
Right. COVID has created some problems with this, finding a community in person. But there are literary centers around the country that still try to do events that are inclusive, for discussion, and like we have we're still doing our writers happy hours, even though we're not actually meeting in person. And not everyone is going to even drink. It's not like a drinking thing. It's just more like a way to talk to each other and catch up, because it's nice to see a face once in a while, that you can interact with. We're getting close to the end of time. I wanted to just here's a question, as a matter of fact. So good thing I said that. So here's a question from Ayana Gray. Where do you think fantasy is heading in the next few years, if you had to speculate? Do you see any rising trends that you're intrigued by or hope take off?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know about trends. I mean, I think just things are getting broader and bigger. You know, people are getting more ambitious with their fantasy, I think. Telling just stories that are like left of center and that aren't the same old, because, you know, fantasy, what we think of that sort of Middle Earth, you know, medieval fantasy we were talking about, but just not even just branching out into other cultures, but branching out into whole other ideas and space fantasy. And so, yeah, I just think that the ball is rolling, and fantasy, and in our culture, because of the Game of Thrones and Harry Potter and things, has gotten so much more popular that it's opened the door on people's ideas. So I can't point to a specific trend other than things are just kind of getting bigger and broader and weirder and cooler in general.
Every time I log on to Publishers Marketplace, I just like to browse the deals and just see what people are buying. I see more and more witch fantasies being bought in the contemporary and high fantasy space. And I think that's going to continue for another few years. That's going to be another big boom. I think that in the adult space, people are looking at paranormal romance again. I hope that that happens for YA. You can't really predict trends. I think that what creates a trend is a book does well, and then 75 other publishers, or not even 75 publishers, like all the other publishers are like, we want that. So then they're actively asking agents, do you have this? Do you have that? Things I've seen agents ask, editors ask for non-Western fantasy. I would like there to be more non-Western fantasy with romance in particular. So it's really just like a waiting game. But at the end of the day, we have to push ourselves to just write the best books that we can, regardless of trend, because the trend is going to come and go. But at the end of the day, like, our books are still going to be there, it's still going to be published. So I like to approach something as hoping that it becomes timeless. And I'm going to talk Deadline City again, but we had Jason Reynolds, who's a contemporary author, come on, and it was our episode where we had the war between fantasy and contemporary, because Jason it's not that he hates fantasy. He made that very clear on the episode. He doesn't hate fantasy. He just wants to see people push the envelope a little bit more, right? He's like, Nora Jemisin did that, right? She wrote a book in second person, right? A fantasy book. So who else is going to push the envelope, right? Who else is going to come up with not the next Game of Thrones, but the next self? Like, what is the next version of you that is going to push the envelope? And that really, really struck me. And now I'm just trying to chase that, right? I'm trying to chase this idea of like, how am I going to write something that is new and not just an Ecuadorian version of XYZ, right? Because we don't want an Ecuadorian version of XYZ. We want the first Ecuadorian thing. So if I look at that, I disregard trend and just write the things that I want to read.
Yes, exactly. Writing the things you want to read. I think that's important. I think retellings are gonna like stay a thing for a while, because everyone is retelling ancient Greek stuff, classic novels. I did a classic novel, but that aside, there's so many countries and so many different stories that can be, put into this format that, like, I think retellings are going to hold on for a while. I don't think they're going anywhere, which is exciting because I love retellings.
Cool. So I want to try to ask my weird convoluted question I mentioned to you before we started live streaming. So I have this thought, so fantasy is a genre. There's many subgenres in the fantasy, and then science fiction is a genre, and there's many subgenres, and there's lots of crossovers. What is it, do you think, about people who enjoy diving in as a reader to the worlds created in this sort of speculative genre? Because I noticed, like, at conventions, that's often a science fiction and fantasy convention. Everyone kind of comes together and gets along really well and is happy to talk about things. I feel like there's something there that gives us hope or gives us an ability to express things that maybe the culture didn't want us to express before, in say maybe a non-genre type way. What is it you think about the magic in writing in fantasy that can really reach people, that maybe that maybe it wouldn't have worked if it was just like a regular mainstream type book? What about that magic? Leslie or Zoraida or Lauren, anyone can.
I mean, it's magic and reaching people. It's sort of like letting your imagination kind of go. Like, you don't have to be. We do magic with rules, but it's not the rules of our society, sort of. So it's sort of like kind of an escape and a release from what you're worrying about in the world. I feel like it's one of the only genres, well, they are science fiction and fantasy, where you can just be like, hey, I'm in this new world with these new rules. It doesn't have to be anything like what I'm doing. But yeah, I think it's more like cathartic, I guess, is the word I'm looking for.
Like being able to create a world where the problems in our world maybe are solved or looked at in a different way.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, that's how I view why I write fantasy. Like what I was trying to do, especially with Earthsinger Chronicles, is write about things that we know without the baggage of our world and our history. So maybe people can look at it separated from their sort of entrenched ideology and look at it from a different perspective. You sort of, put the sugar in the medicine, the sugar of magic and another world and the fantastical elements, and then have people try to confront the issues of today. And that's what fantasy and science fiction have done forever, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they can be powerful. We talk in metaphor, and I think N.K. Jemisin said that, it's time to stop using metaphor and do things more, I don't know what her quote was, but stop using so much metaphor and confront things like more head on. And I still think, she definitely is doing that in her fantasy. And it can work both ways. It can be very confrontational and very on the nose, but without it's not on the nose because you have those other elements on it. So that's part of the thing that, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because people can read a story and enjoy it and curiously miss what the author was trying to do with it.
Right.
But you hope. They say that reading creates empathy, and I think it's my hope that over time that empathy will increase the more that people read the stories and it slips into their mind and hopefully changes them in some way.
Cool. We just have a couple more minutes. Zoraida, did you want to speak on that question as well?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there's a reason why episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer are about the transformation of a monster, or Angel loses a soul after Buffy, like he and Buffy have sex, because like it's a metaphor for like the way boys or somebody will change after getting to a different level of a relationship. I think fantasy gives us a way to process the reality without having to confront the reality at the same time. But then that's the problem. Like, why should I have to have a metaphor of magic as racism when why can't we just talk about racism, right? And so that's a complicated question, and I it goes back to like, let's push ourselves to write different kinds of books. Yeah, that's it.
So we have a couple more questions. I only have about 2 minutes, but maybe we'll go 2 minutes over just to get 30-second answers from everybody on these questions. I think they're really good questions. When creating non-Western worlds and using cultural words and terms, do you have to define all those new words in the story just for the Western audience, and how do you do that?
I think that you shouldn't just think about the Western audience. I think that if you're writing specifically in the American market, the North American market, it's going to be in English, right? So I don't only think about white people if I have a word in Spanish. I think about any non-Spanish speaking person and how I have to get the definition across, right? I think that there's this fallacy where we think that, oh, like you just, yes, I can look up a word, but do I want, if I put down this book to look up a word, am I going to come back to it? Right. And sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. I think that there are some books where if it's a like for fantasy books, where it's a fake made up language, the context still has to be there and the definition still has to be there. So I think that the same rules should apply for languages based on for non-English languages, right? We need to have those context clues, and we need to make sure. There's a Kurt Vonnegut quote, which I'm going to butcher, which is like, the reader needs to know, the reader has to have all the information, right? Like your reader should not be confused. And I think that applies with contemporary as it does with fantasy.
Absolutely.
I agree. Yeah. Context is everything. Like, what are they doing with the item? Like, who are they talking to using the word? Context. Yeah. Perfect. You don't have to define it outright.
Perfect. And the final question, how do you push back or work with your white publishing team to ensure representation in your story, your cover, and your marketing? I was going to ask a question about stock photos and how those have evolved, but this is sort of encompasses that as well. Maybe Leslie wants to start us off on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people can feel like they're in weird positions where they can't push back. I think it's important to be really clear. If you can do it at the contract stage and say, it's really important to me that, these are things I'm not willing to change. You're not going to necessarily get cover control, but pushing your agent to make sure that you have that review and that what you're willing to walk away from. That's like, it's not worth it to me to even publish this book if you're going to insist that I do these changes. So having that, being able to take a stand. Like, I knew if they were trying to change the cover, I was very proud to have a Black woman on my cover. And if I had gone to a traditional publisher and they were like, nope, you have to change it and whitewash it would have been a no-go. So those are things you have to know your stand on. And especially in this climate, if someone is trying to challenge you on something like that, where it's compromising your vision and your story, I don't know that they're going to want to have that publicized. So it's kind of like, as you push back, I'm not saying threaten them, but being like, yeah. Is this the hill that you want to die on? Do you want this to be known that you're trying to make me change this thing, this cultural thing, this racial characteristic or whatever? So I'm sure it still happens, but hopefully, because we're in this climate where, we're pushing for more diverse stories, that people won't feel pressured to do that.
Yeah, I think you also need to have a really good agent, because when I faced this in when I was publishing Labyrinth Lost, right? Like, the original title for the book was called Bruja, and my publisher was like, we don't think the readership is going to understand this. And like, that was coded language for, we don't think white English speakers are going to be able to understand this, even though I think it's a pretty common word now. But then they changed their tune. 2 years later, they want to name the second book, Bruja Born. And I was like, okay, so you didn't want to listen to me 2 years ago, but it took 2 years of publishing sort of making strides and changes, and seeing like, oh, maybe people do want to read books by Latinos. I think that if I had stuck to my guns, like things, you never know, right? But if I think that it's all in your advocate. I think it's coming from the get-go. Your publisher needs to understand who you are, what your book is, and what is what can you not compromise on. And making those things clear makes for a better publishing journey. And that all starts with your agent.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. And the important thing is that when you're in the submission phase of submitting your book out, your agent's submitting it, you're kind of like have the wheel, you at that point, if you get offers, you get to choose, do I want these people, sort of presenting my book to the world? And I am very blessed to be with Wednesday Books, because they really know what they're doing, and they're very respectful to cultures, and they're very good at presenting my book in a way that really represents it. Awesome.
Oh, we got a thing here. Yeah, Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and close now. And I just wanted to just say before we turn off the live stream that the Muse Writers Center is really happy to have been part of this talk today. Our new fall schedule will be coming out in early December. So please check out our website, the-muse.org, for our online class schedule and also information on our events, our Teen Fellowship, Giving Tuesday. If you'd like to support or sponsor our Diversity 2020 series, there's also information on the website about that. And please join us tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for Music and Verse, featuring musicians, spoken word poets, and a closing reading by Louisa A. Agloria, who's the Poet Laureate of Virginia and our very good friend and board member. We'd like to just thank the community for watching and listening and joining our discussion. I want to thank especially Lauren and Zoraida and Leslie for being here today for a great discussion. And just thank you again, everyone who is watching and who has been here today. Stay safe and stay healthy and stay creative and have a wonderful afternoon. And we're very, very happy to have been part of this series. And at the end, I'll just say go Trojans, because I went to USC and we're playing Utah tonight. Anyway, thank you so much again, Lauren and Zoraida and Leslie. You guys are awesome, and it's so nice to hear your voices, and I'm so filled with joy with your publishing success.
Thank you.
And
Thanks,
thank you
Michael.
also to our technical staff for helping us out, Susan and Sean. Thank you. We'll see you at the next event, 7 o'clock.